We're moving into the area of the program where we're going to talk about, as we do every year, the consequences of investigative reporting. And generally speaking, not the positive consequences, at least for those of us who do it. And to start us off, to get us in the mood and to reflect on recent experiences, David Barstow, who I'm about to introduce, is not only a two-time Pulitzer Prize winner, but just also was awarded the Polk Award. And just as a way of introduction or full disclosure, David and I worked together at the New York Times. I introduced him to the idea of doing an investigative story in print and television. He actually went on television. I think is it the last time you've been on television? So if you see this guy in the program who's got very wide eyes, that's David. But it didn't kill him. He actually, his first documentary experience won every award in broadcasting, so along with the Pulitzer Prize. So, but David is, for those of us who are in the geriatric side of the investigative reporting world, David is the kind of person that you want to meet because he's not only young, but he seems a lot older than he is. He's very good. And you do not want David on your trail or on you if there's something going wrong in your company or in the government. And so he's agreed to talk and give a brief talk on the consequences of investigative reporting and address, I don't have a title here. What's the title? A cautionary tale? A cautionary tale. David Barstow.
I think probably all of us in this room have some version of the story that I'm about to tell you, but the story that I'm about to tell you is a story that deeply affected the way I think about consequences, the consequences of the reporting we do, the consequences to our sources. And this one, thankfully for me, happened very early in my journalism career. I was in Florida. I worked for the St. Petersburg Times, and I covered criminal justice. And at that time in Florida, the state was sort of beginning to prosecute more and more juvenile offenders in the adult prison system. And they were putting a lot of teenagers into adult prisons. And I wanted to find a way to write about that subject. And I came upon the idea of, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to find the youngest inmate in the Florida prison system, and I'm going to focus on his case as a way to get at this. And it didn't take me long to find this kid. His name was Eddie McGee. He was 12 years old when he stuck up a laundromat in Pensacola, Florida. And he was, when I found him, he was 14 years old, and he was serving a 10-year prison sentence in a Florida prison, sharing a cell with a man who was on his second tour of the Florida prison system. And Eddie was roughly 5'2", 130 pounds when he was sentenced to 10 years. And I tracked him down and spent a lot of time with him, interviewing him in prison. And as you can imagine, all of the horrible things that would happen to a 13-year-old at the time he entered the prison system happened to Eddie in prison. And he spent actually much of the first year of his incarceration in solitary confinement for his own protection. But what really drew me to that particular story was that as I dug deeper into Eddie's case, the reason why he got sent to an adult prison was right out of Kafka. In Florida, when you're a juvenile offender and you commit an offense, they kind of give you a score. They look at the crime that you've done, and they look at the severity of the crime, they look at your background, they look at your priors, and they give you a numerical score. And the higher your numerical score, the more secure the juvenile facility that you're going to end up in. And because Eddie's crime involved a handgun, he scored out in the juvenile system to the most secure juvenile facility in Florida. However, in Florida, the law was that you had to be 14 years old, at least 14 years old, in order to be put into this juvenile facility. And so because he was too young for this juvenile facility, the state of Florida, in all its wisdom, decided to send him to an adult prison instead. When I wrote this story, I wrote a very long story about this case. It touched off an immediate furor. And it brought an enormous amount of embarrassment and discredit to the court system in Pensacola, the police department in Pensacola, the prosecutors in Pensacola, and immediately the governor got involved, and they removed Eddie from the adult prison system, and they put him into this juvenile facility. And I remember the reaction in the newsroom when this happened, and my own personal reaction, feeling like, wow, this is really why I got into journalism. I made a change. I caused a lot of internal discussion in the state of Florida about this policy. And in the bargain, Eddie had been removed from a fairly hellish situation and put into a place where, even though it was still fairly secure, he was going to get an education, he was going to get counseling, he was going to get job training, all the things that do not exist in the Florida prison system. So years went past, and I dropped out of touch with Eddie, and I had a file, as we all do, of stories we might want to come back to someday. And I came across this file at a point when I was between stories, and it told me that Eddie was about to get out of the juvenile facility. And I thought, this would be a really good chance for me to go back and follow up on Eddie's case and see what's it like for him going back to Pensacola, and has he gotten anything out of this whole experience. And I quickly tracked him down. He was only a few months out, and I tracked him down in Pensacola. He went back to the exact same neighborhood where he had grown up, and I quickly, to my horror, learned a couple of things about Eddie. The first thing I learned from Eddie himself was that being transferred from adult prison to the juvenile facility had been a horrific experience for him. Because in the juvenile facility, the way boys sort of determined the kind of social pecking order was by having fights with whoever was seen as being the toughest kid in the facility. And because he, coming out of an adult prison, that kind of stamped him immediately as the kid that you wanted to take on when you entered into that juvenile facility. And he actually spent years in fights, in quite brutal fights, in the juvenile facility. And he said it to me plainly. He said it to me within the first half hour of me reconnecting with him, that it had been the worst years of his life when he went into this juvenile facility. The second thing that I discovered, to my horror, was that the Pensacola justice system had not forgotten about this kid. It had been very embarrassing to them, and when he went back to his neighborhood, the same police officers who had been part of the team that arrested him originally had their eye on him. And sure enough, before too long, he was in the back of a car. They pulled into a gas station. The police stopped the car. They searched the car, and they found a joint under the floor mat in the passenger front seat. And Eddie was arrested for violating his probation, because in Florida, under the terms of your probation, you're not allowed to be around drugs. And he went back in front of the same judge who had initially sentenced him. And this judge was quite famous in Florida. He was famous because he had been asked to decide a custody matter involving a young teenage girl. And the decision that he had to make was whether to send this girl to her mother, who was a lesbian, or to her father, who had just been released for murder. And he decided to transfer this girl into the custody of her father because he didn't approve of the mother's lifestyle. And I remember vividly sitting in the courtroom as Eddie got brought in on this violation of probation. And under Florida law, when you violate your probation, you can be sentenced for up to the maximum of the underlying offense. So in this case, the maximum sentence for armed robbery in Florida, this particular sentence, was 27 years in prison. He had initially been sentenced to 10 years, So he faced a maximum of 17 additional years for being in a car with a marijuana cigarette in it. And I sat there and watched as this judge looked at Eddie McGee and sentenced him to 17 years in prison for being in that car. I have on my desk at the New York Times a photograph of Eddie McGee. I've had that picture there during my entire time at the New York Times because it reminds me of the complexity of questions of consequence to the people that we write about, but also the consequences to ourselves. I've never forgotten this young man, and I feel sometimes deeply torn in my own mind about my role in writing about him and what I ended up potentially doing to his life. And I think it has really changed the way I think about consequences. When I first got into journalism, you know, I was very much affected by Watergate, and I felt so much about, you know, that, and we're always constantly in this business, we're asked about the consequences of the work that we do, and when someone gets prosecuted because of something we've written, people are sort of like, oh, aren't you, you know, you must be so pleased, something is happening, a law gets changed, you must be so pleased, congressional hearings are held, you must be so pleased, or if nothing happens, people will say, aren't you disappointed? And this case really changed the way I thought about those judgments. It made me reflect and think about how careful we should be about getting too excited when something happens because of something we've written. And it's made me remain more focused on not the specific outcomes of the things that I write about, but focus more on the structural role that I play in a democracy. And so with that very unhappy and downer tale, maybe now it's a good time to bring the panelists up and you can carry it on further. Thank you very much.